The but Bill was able to publish both these things, and I think to entertain the thought that, maybe one was mostly right, but in other circumstances the other could be somewhat right. And I think that's true of a lot of different issues, both at the sort of philosophical level almost and at the very practical political level in terms of his editorship of National Review and in terms of his general shepherding of the conservative movement. And I think that's a very important lesson in this moment, which is an interesting moment, a very hopeful moment, I think, for conservatism. But I think it's very hard to know exactly what, I mean, certainly a lot of us would have been wrong if we had predicted in 2004 how things would look in 2008, or if we had predicted in 2009 which elements of conservatism would be most resurgent, what themes that the Tea Party would come into existence at all, or what themes it would pick up and find most resonance. And I still think it's hard to it's hard to predict in that kind of modesty that Bill had, actually, I think, and humility, really, beneath the, fantastic, somewhat, I don't know what's the right word, but, not so humble exterior sometimes. The great confidence he gave that was part of his great charm. I think underneath that confidence was a kind of intellectual and political modesty, which combined with a real turbocharged energy and intelligence, obviously, I think, to enable the conservative movement to do something that's really, really amazing. I mean, we do not, I'll just close with this thought, we do not appreciate, it's very hard to appreciate now, it all looks like it, of course it happened, Bill Buckley founded National Review, and then 25 years later Ronald Reagan was president, and 10 years later the Cold War ended satisfactorily, and Reagan was a successful president, and then Rudy Giuliani was able in New York to do some of the things that, in a way, Bill Buckley had talked a little bit about in 1965, and various conservative principles would be vindicated in practice, and in other areas we'd make at least some progress. I mean, none of that was inevitable, and none of that was likely, really, when Bill Buckley founded National Review, or even 10 or 20 years later. And the degree of boldness, the degree of vision, the willingness to gamble, we underestimate today. And I think that's also a key legacy and a key lesson of Bill Buckley. We shouldn't, on the one hand, we shouldn't immanentize the eschaton, we shouldn't be utopian about what might happen in the next year or two or three, but we shouldn't underestimate the chances for radical reform in a good direction either. We shouldn't be too practical, think we know ahead of time necessarily what the limits of progress in certain conservative or libertarian or neoconservative, whatever we want, sensible constitutionalist pro-American directions are. So I think in that respect, Bill's kind of latitudinarianism, if that's the right word, about conservatism within certain limits, and his willingness to adjust and to change and to take his guidance to some degree from the market, from the political market, from public opinion, which may not be wise in its individuals, but is in its entirety is often sensible. That's a very impressive and I think important lesson from Bill Buckley.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Rich. I donated my knees to the Yale lacrosse team a half century ago, so I'm going to stand here. I'm also acutely aware that I stand between you and the bar, so let me make a few brief comments. Three things about Bill, and then I'm going to plunge recklessly into the territory both these wiser men refuse to travel. And that's what Bill would think today about various things. Three things about Bill. One, extraordinary personal courage in both the moral and physical forms of courage. As one example, one measure of the correlation of ideological forces, I think back to my class at Yale, maybe somebody here, late 50s, early 60s. We approached graduation that glorious June day when John Kennedy got off the Great Line. I now have the best of all worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. We sought to show support for our emerging champion, Barry Goldwater. And from a class of 1,000 young men, all men in those days, we had 5 supporters. Not included in our number, I would note for the historical record, was our hard-drinking classmate Richard B. Cheney. as God is my witness, Dick Cheney was a 160-pound scatback on the football team. Not included in our number was a quiet econ major named Arthur Laffer. As scrawny as our ranks were in the undergraduate college, they dwarfed our support among the faculty. The faculty, 700 strong approximately in those days, yielded 2 supporters. One was a feisty lecturer in the Yale Law School named Robert Bork. The other was an Asian scholar named Dave Rao, who contributed articles to the journal Rich Now edits. Yeah. We would have had 50% more support, but for the recent defenestration of Wilmore Kendall after a long and difficult battle with tenure. The second thing I'd say about Bill is what Rich mentioned, and a critical ingredient is joy. Every Buckley enterprise was aimed at high purpose, but pursued in high spirit. The sound that rings in memory is Bill's laughter. Bill in the office with a colleague, Bill on the phone with a delicious story, Bill on the boat with many of his best friends. I'll give you just one example here. This is years after the event, and I obtained excerpts of Bill's interview with the FBI. They're investigating me for a federal appointment. As these fellows know, at the end of a field investigation, the agent asks this omnibus fanny-covering question: would I, candidate Freeman, be likely to embarrass the administration? Witness Buckley, under oath, is recorded as saying, "I should think that the reverse is much more likely." But let me give you, again, proceeding recklessly, this is how I think Bill might proceed. He might march through the following agenda. First, he would summon for catechismic instruction all of the Republican stalwarts. And my projection is that it would go like this. Mitt Romney, invited to dinner at 73rd Street, would have been given a pass on gun control, abortion, universal health care. Bill believed that every human being is endowed by his creator with the right to flip-flop. Bill would have bored in instead on what he perceived to be a lacuna. Instead, the lacuna, namely the widespread presumption that Romney can fix our broken economy with an economic plan that is, unlike, say, Governor Huntsman's, manifestly inadequate to the challenge. Bill might have asked his guest, how do you reconcile, Mitt, that which is irreconcilable? Romney would have squirmed through the evening. Bill would have barely survived it. He hated to drink alone. Rick Perry's visit would have triggered the full Buckley charm offensive. Tales of the original WFB and his wildcatting days in Mexico would have spiced the evening. Bill would have taken it upon himself as a kind of party favor to support Perry's single most indefensible action as governor. Toward the end of a long article, Bill would have recast Perry's initiative as not only defensible, but in some ways laudable. Indeed, as Bill probed more deeply, a boon to the nation, quite possibly to the world. Perry would have responded with a Dan Rather-sized Texasism, an impenetrable aphorism somehow involving parched land and poisonous snakes. Bill would have segued into a discourse on why contemporary international affairs call for a foreign policy somewhat less parochial than the governor has heretofore advanced. When Sarah Palin came to lunch, Bill would have been on his best behavior. Patsy, his wife, might even have persuaded him not to eat the salad with his fingers. After an hour and a half, Bill would have concluded reluctantly, under the unbending terms of the Buckley rule, that Palin was sufficiently rightward but insufficiently viable. As they parted that afternoon, Bill would have accepted an invitation to go spear hunting for large mammals deep inside the Arctic Circle. A commitment that neither Sarah nor Patsy would ever let him forget. The session with Newt Gingrich would have caused Bill to remark the speaker's X-ray vision, his barbed wit, his broad range of reference and allusion. It might also have caused Bill to remember an observation by the late Herman Kahn, who said some people learn by reading through the eye, others through the ear by listening. I learned through the mouth by talking. The summit meeting with Herman Cain would have excited high anticipation. Bill would have relished the prospect of a Cain-Buckley alliance, if only for its sheer theatricality. During their time together, Bill would have spent his time much as he had with Palin, in a quiet inventory of the intellectual warehouse. What does Cain know? What has he read? Is it just possible that Cain could be Bill's guy? Beyond the political arena, Bill would have had advice for his core constituencies. To the hardy band of right-leaning scholars in the American Academy, including here, he would have said, be brave, but until you have secured tenure, be no more brave than conscience demands. Reject and reverse the proto-liberal counsel of St. Augustine when he famously prayed, O Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. By all means, concentrate your careerist energy on the edge of evolving scholarship, but celebrate loudly and redundantly the core values of the Western canon. To the stewards of his movement's public diplomacy, the editors and publishers, writers and producers, talking heads, bloggers, Bill would say, keep handy the metrics of fusionism and appreciate the vital contribution to our coalition made by each major strain of conservatism. Avoid sectarianism, adhere strictly to principle, but labor without pause to coin the fresh formulations for our timeless proposition. And along the way, remember to have some fun. Try to be a little less constipated. Let me close by saying why I have chosen to support the Buckley program. There are two reasons, really. The first is to keep alive a long-standing but very fragile tradition here at Yale. Decade after decade, Yale has done almost nothing to encourage, but just enough to permit a culture of conservative dissent. I like to think of it as Yale's grudging but honorable acquiescence to the spirit of academic freedom. The second reason to support this program is that Bill would have loved it. Bill had the most complicated relationship with Yale of any student since Nathan Hale.